Welcome to Rock Center Shorts. My name is Mike Callahan. I'm the Executive Director at the Rock Center for Corporate Governance. And I'm delighted to be joined today by one of my colleagues for a discussion around vaccine and vaccine mandates. And I'd like to first introduce Professor Michelle Mello, who is a leading empirical health law scholar whose research is focused on understanding the effects of law and regulation on healthcare delivery and population health outcomes. She is a professor of law at Stanford Law School and also holds a joint appointment as a professor of medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine. She's the author of more than 200 articles on medical liability, public health law, pharmaceuticals and vaccines, biomedical research, ethics and governance, and health information privacy, among other topics. And her publications appear in medical, health policy, and law journals. And she is a frequent contributor to the New England Journal of Medicine. Michelle, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
And so as we get into the discussion around how the company should think about vaccines and vaccine mandates, I know you had one issue you wanted to cover real quickly.
Yeah, I just want to make a disclosure that's relevant to our discussion today, which is that I serve as an advisor to Verily Life Sciences on a product that's designed to return people to school and work safely.
Thank you for letting us know about that. And so our audience is mostly corporate board members and corporate execs. And one of the questions that's been coming up recently in the wake of the federal mandate that we've read about in the news, what's the current legal landscape on vaccine mandates for private employers? Can they require vaccines to come back to work? And we'd love to get your views on this.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the question of can they require it as opposed to must they require it, are they covered by the Biden rule? The critical piece of law here is the set of federal civil rights laws that protect people with disabilities and protect religious liberty, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the American with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And it's pretty clear at this point that those federal civil rights laws do not prohibit an employer from imposing a vaccination requirement during COVID-19 as long as it's implemented in an even-handed way and consistent with the requirements of those statutes relating to disability and religious objections. Now, whether it's permissible as a matter of state law, I'll give the usual lawyer's answer. It varies from state to state. So we have about 15 states at this time that have done various things to restrict the liberty of employers, sometimes all employers, sometimes just government employers, to impose vaccination mandates. So any company would want to be aware of their state's law as well.
And is California generally one where you can require or uncertain?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So you mentioned equal application and complying with other laws and regulations. How should companies handle that issue about requested exemptions for medical and religious reasons? I understand from what you said they need to do that, but what is their best practice to consider, and how much evidence can employers ask for? What's your thoughts on how to handle that?
Yeah, so most of the requests that employers will get will probably be for religious exemptions. They may get medical exemption requests in the form of a disability accommodation. There aren't very many people who have true medical contraindications to COVID vaccination, but they may feel that having some underlying condition like being in chemotherapy, for example, makes it ill-advised for them, and so they would fit within the federal disability statutes. Now, we're really fortunate in that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, has spoken now twice and very clearly about these issues, and that guidance is available to everybody online at EEOC's website. If you simply Google EEOC COVID vaccination guidance, you'll get a whole bunch of FAQs that answer virtually any question you might have about your ability to require vaccination in the face of these civil rights laws. But the upshot is, as for other kinds of medical requirements for jobs, an employer has to offer a reasonable accommodation for a religious or disability-related objection unless it would pose an undue hardship to the employer. Now, Title VII's definition of undue hardship, which relates to religious objections, is really employer-friendly. All the employer has to show is that this requested accommodation would impose more than a de minimis burden on the employer. The standard for disability-related accommodations under the ADA is higher. The employer has to make a little bit more of a showing. But under both these statutes, the employer can decline to provide a reasonable accommodation if it can show that the employee poses a direct threat, meaning a significant risk of substantial harm to others and disrupts the safety of the workplace. And that's going to be a fact-dependent inquiry. It might be true in some employment settings and not others. For example, a nursing home looks different than a tech company. When an employer gets a request, for example, for a religious accommodation, how should it handle it? Generally, the practice is to give the employee the benefit of the doubt, that employers don't have to look behind these requests too hard. But we are in a very special time when people have, in very large numbers, objections to COVID vaccines in a way that we've never seen before. And many of these folks are people whose objections are of a personal belief nature or a political ideological nature, but not really a religious nature. And they're looking for ways to identify a route to expressing those objections, and religious exemptions are the route that they choose. So EEOC contemplates that in some circumstances, employers might have reason to be skeptical about an employee's claim, and in that case, they can ask for additional supporting information. The employee doesn't have to show that she's a member of a recognized religious denomination, that she goes to church, or doesn't have to have a letter from her pastor. But if it sounds like it doesn't relate to a religious belief so much as a other objection to vaccination, that's reason to be skeptical. And if the employee has received 35 other vaccines and this is the first time that it's coming up, again, the employer has the right to question the sincerity of that belief.
Got it. Great. Thank you so much for the practical side of that advice. Super helpful. One more question on kind of the practical side. So if employers are going to ask for verification of vaccination when people come back to work, are there special considerations they should be thinking about there too?
I think my main advice is to anticipate lots of wrong claims about the employee's privacy. Many of our political leaders have been spreading half-truths about what privacy law protects. And just to be very clear, HIPAA, our federal health information privacy law, does not apply when you ask an employee to disclose the fact or non-fact of vaccination. This is not a question about a disability. It does not fit within that. The employer has to keep the information confidential. It's still health information, and it has to be treated like other medical information. But the employee cannot simply say, you're violating my privacy rights to ask about this. It's simply not true. The other thing to keep in mind, though, on the other side is just make sure that any questions that you're asking about the employee's health status or health conditions are job-related and consistent with business necessity. And again, that's going to play out differently depending on what kind of industry and shop that you're running, and in particular, whether you're talking about bringing employees back to the office or not.
Thank you for that. Yeah, guidance and training for the frontline employees that are going to be interacting with folks on these issues sounds pretty critical. Last question for me. The issue of diversity and inclusion is top of mind for companies and has been for some time now. And given some reports in the media about vaccine reticence in certain communities that may be underrepresented in corporate America or corporate leadership, should companies be considering these cultural inclusion concerns in these decisions about vaccines, or do you have a view on that?
Well, it's a really important question. I'm glad you asked it. Things have evolved quite a bit over the last 9 months since vaccines have been available. And at this point in time, reticence doesn't look that different across the different racial and ethnic groups. When you ask them, are you already vaccinated? Are you going to do it ASAP? Or is it more of a wait and see feeling? Or are you saying only if I'm required to, or definitely not under any circumstances? By far, it's more white people than black or brown people who are in the definitely not category. As of June, 14% white versus 11% black, 9% Hispanic. Blacks are actually twice as likely as whites to say they will get it if it's required. And Hispanics are also higher than whites. So in a sense, a mandate actually may be helpful in bringing the vaccine to a group that otherwise would be hanging back. And the proportions are pretty similar across these racial and ethnic groups for people who say they're kind of in the wait and see category. So, this all speaks to me in a way that sort of sums up as this is not going to intrude more on one group than another at this point in time. Where ethnicity and race does matter is in access. There are ongoing differences in people's perceived ability to access the vaccines. Obviously, at this point, it's not difficult to get your hands on one. You can walk into any drugstore, but there are people who still feel that they face practical barriers to getting to a vaccination site, figuring out where to go, what to do, how to get it, how to get the time off. And that's also true for vaccinating their kids, which is an important piece of this puzzle, right? If we want healthy employees, we also have to have healthy families. So good advice for employers would be to create the conditions for zero access barriers, either by bringing vaccinations on site, providing transportation for workers to get to vaccination sites, and really critically, providing extra PTO for people to bring family members for vaccination and to take that day or two that we all felt we needed after that second vaccine to get back on our feet feeling good and ready to be back at work. Creating zero access barriers is by far the best thing that we can do to help these minority communities.
That's great. Michelle, thank you so much for the guidance. This is extremely helpful for our community, and really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to be with us today.
Thanks.